Curt, we are very happy to have you here and very curious to hear about your findings.
Okay, excellent. Thank you so much for inviting me. During my talk, feel free to ask me questions if you want me to elaborate on things. I can probably keep talking for like 2 hours, and I don't think that's the plan. So whatever you want me to elaborate on, that's fine. I'm totally flexible. And before I get started, I want to say a little bit about kind of this teaching professor role. So I'm from the University of California, San Diego, that's in Southern California, right on the Mexico border. And in the UC system, we have this role of teaching professor. And I wanted to kind of say a little bit more about this because it kind of like helps frame the research that I'm doing. Basically, the teaching professor series is different from lecturers. We also have lecturers. But so about 8% of the faculty in our School of Engineering are teaching professors, and other faculty in our department, they kind of have your regular assignment. They do mostly research, they do some teaching and some service. Teaching professors, we are also engineers. I have a PhD in electrical engineering, but our focus is more on teaching and then how to teach engineering classes. So my research is a little bit domain research, but also pedagogy. And so we kind of form a bridge between like a teaching and learning commons, and so the pedagogy experts, and then domain experts. But other than that, our roles, faculty roles are exactly the same. Actually, I was hired originally as a regular faculty member, and then I kind of started focusing more on teaching and thinking about how to teach. But so yeah, there's like pay skills, tenure, all of that, it's basically the same. So, so my research is a little bit more, or my work is more on thinking about teaching. I wanted to mention, I want to mention a little bit more about things that I do, again, to frame kind of the role a little bit. So I also work on flipped classrooms, or I use flipped classrooms in all my classes. So in case you're not familiar with it, in a traditional classroom, you basically teach students in lecture, right? And they go home and they try to process what they've learned in lecture, the information that they got there. For the flipped classroom, you give an assignment to students. So basically, they learn the theory before they come to class. And then in class, you do more participatory exercises. And so kind of like what you see there, you see students discussing, and this can be done in a traditional lecture. Now, this is not something new. This exists for a while, but it's something that we have adopted for all our large intro classes in our department. So our first and second year classes, they're all kind of based on a flipped classroom model. It works really well. Students like it. I like it. I think students learn a lot through this model. So this is one of the things that we're doing. Another area of research that I'm looking at is looking at competencies. So in case anybody's interested in kind of like talking more about that later. So engineers don't need to just be technically proficient, right? They need to do more than just learn the theory and basically be good engineers. There are all these other things. They need to be able to be good communicators, right? They need to be able to, in verbally and in writing, need to be team players, and need to have leadership skills, social awareness, and all of that. So we call these broader engineering skills. The National Academy of Engineering has put a big focus on that. Also our National Science Foundation and our accreditation as well. These are actually the things that we need to show for our ABET accreditation. Now, how do we at UCSD typically teach these competencies? We have a class in which, for example, communication skills, we have a class in which students have to present. And so we say, okay, students have to present, and that's it. Now, okay, kind of satisfies ABET, it satisfies the accreditation. But if you think about it, if you want to learn how to, I don't know, sail a boat, you are definitely not gonna just read a book, you need to do it, right? But also, I'm not gonna just put you on a boat and say, good luck, and teach yourself how to sail, right? That is, for sailing, there's like decades, centuries, millennia of expertise right? Things that people know that work, I would teach you that first, and then you get to practice, right? And so we don't do that with a lot of these competencies in engineering. So we just tell students just present, but we don't teach them how to present. And so we started looking at this where we're like, maybe there is a lot of existing knowledge in these fields that we can share. Basically, let's say public speaking, right? There's a lot of information, a lot of knowledge that people have gathered over the centuries that we can teach students, still provide them with opportunities to apply, then give them feedback, that's the reinforcement part, and also teach them how to kind of self-reflect on what they're doing and get better. And so we've now started looking at teaching students how to learn. Being lifelong learners is one of these broader skills, but we typically assume that when students come to our classes, that they know that they shouldn't just be memorizing things. They should basically be able to apply and analyze and basically reach the higher levels of Bloom's taxonomy, but we never teach them how to study that way. We just assume that they somehow do that, right? And so we're kind of looking at how can we actually teach students how to learn. This is a new project just started this year. Similarly, problem solving. We assume that basically students become good problem solvers by doing projects, but there is a lot of knowledge on problem solving from fields like engineering, but also from business, management, the military. There's a lot of problem solving kind of techniques that we don't teach our students. So we've actually created a semester-long course on problem solving. We're now modifying for high school students. We're now modifying that to teach to our students at large at the university as a general education course. And I've also started looking at how can we make this shorter to be modules that we can teach students who start project-based learning. And that's what I'm doing at ETH right now as part of my sabbatical. So right now I'm sabbatical there. And so looking at that, does it make sense to teach students problem solving before they start doing project-based learning? So that's kind of all in this idea of like competencies. We have to kind of tell them a little bit more. Okay, so now, so you have kind of an idea of like the things that I look at, and oral exams is one of these projects. And so we actually started looking at oral exams right at the start of COVID. So what happened was we're on the quarter system at UC San Diego. And so when we had to go remote, this was 2 days before the final exam started. So we suddenly had to switch our written exams to be remote with Zoom proctoring, and we weren't quite sure if that was gonna work. And so some of us basically did like spot checking of students, basically where the performance was not according to what we expected based on previous performance. We would basically have a follow-up oral exam for those students. And the interesting thing was I did catch, and it was only like a handful of students, I did catch a few that were basically cheating. But also there were some other students who did much better on the oral exam. And I asked them like, wait, that's weird, but like what happened? And they're like, well, I was kind of intimidated by the fact that I had to give an oral exam. And so I studied a lot more and I knew I had to explain it to you. So now I had to make sure that I could explain these things, not just know how to do them, but also explain them. And I'm like, that's interesting. Can I maybe kind of replicate that in the future? And so together with some colleagues, and they're all listed there on the right, we started this 3-year project. It just finished, and we were gonna look at, can we do these oral exams in large engineering courses? We implemented this in both large and small courses. We had 10 unique courses and several offerings of some of these. So quite a few students, and the idea was to explore the design space. How can we organize this oral exam? There's different variations that we can do, and this is all funded by the National Science Foundation. And so I don't have.
Ask you a question.
Yeah, sure.
Here, because what you found interesting was the observation that the modality of the exam changed how the students prepared, and so they had a better performance.
Yes.
So doing more oral exams would be one conclusion possible, but from there, you could have also had other conclusions like we need to have more time during course, during learning time and not performing time, where students would, for example, have to explain something. So somehow mimicking the mechanism that you had identified as a learning process. Why did you choose as a conclusion to extend the oral exam and not take other paths?
So actually, I think we probably kind of like looped around back to kind of more the learning process, as you're kind of suggesting, like as we were doing this study. It was because of what the students told me. It's because they had to do the exam with me that they now changed the learning process. It was kind of that that need for the exam to kind of like we had talked about doing these things, and this was actually a flipped class as already. So we already had a lot of that explaining to each other. So we already had these components in there, but it was kind of the forcer of the exam that kind of got students like, okay, now I really need to acquire this. That's why we started thinking in that direction. But it's a good point, and I think, and hopefully I'll answer more of that as I kind of go through it. Now, again, I need to give a little bit of context here, because as we did the design space exploration, it's a very kind of broad field. So it's kind of good to know where we were coming from. So we have, as I mentioned already, we have a quarter system. So it's 10 weeks of lectures, but basically most of our classes have one or more midterms. Homework that students have to turn in for a grade. So there's already a lot of kind of grading touch points for the students during the term. And then we have a finals week where each class has a 3-hour exam slot. So all the students in the class will take this 3-hour final exam. Now, in case you're kind of like also wondering like where my accent is from, I'm actually from Belgium, and I got my undergraduate. I studied in Leuven. So there, all our exams were oral exams for every single class, every single engineering class. And so, as a student, I've gone through this, and there, what they do, how did they scale it to large classes? Basically, a large class is divided into groups of like 20 to 30 students, and each group kind of has a different exam slot. Of course, lots of work for the instructor. They have to kind of keep on examining students for weeks to just get sometimes for weeks to get all the students. Now, that was a problem for us because students, of course, have another class as well, and so this would then overlap. And so this whole idea of doing it in groups kind of works if you do that for every class. So like either all your classes are have oral final exams, and then you just have to schedule all these groups, and every group is kind of different exam schedule, or well, we couldn't do that. So we were stuck with our 3-hour final exam. So what did we look at? We were not planning to replace our final exam. We just couldn't. We couldn't examine 200 students in a 3-hour time slot. That this was not going to happen. So we looked at oral exams and oral assessments as a supplemental component. So adding it somewhere during the term, somewhere during the quarter, or replacing one of the midterms with an oral exam, because then you kind of have more time to kind of spread things out. Right, so this is kind of the context that we were working in. And then, so yeah, we were kind of exploring the different options. Basically, all of us ended up doing like short exam slots of 15 to 20 minutes per student. Typically like 15 minutes with a 5-minute kind of break in between. In case it kind of ran a little long and that kind of stuff. Most of our exams were on Zoom because, well, we were doing this during COVID. That's when we started, so it's kind of a necessity. people continued using Zoom because it was easier than, because we didn't have to schedule rooms to do these exams. It's kind of tough for like 200 students. However, I did do for one class, I did do it in person. And then during these exams, we focused on conceptual problems. So because we kept the written final, we felt that the procedural knowledge we would test on the written exam. So basically here's a large problem, solve it. Those kind of questions were still on the written exam, but then what we were focusing on for the oral exam was the why and the when. So here at the bottom is kind of an example. On the left, you see the problem. So by the way, this is, I don't know what your backgrounds are exactly, but so this is from my class, is a circuit from an intro to circuits class in electrical engineering. And so these are just guiding kind of prompts so that students can solve something. The main idea was they're already familiar with the circuits, so that it's not like they need time to think about it. They're already familiar with the circuit, but then on the exam, we would ask these kind of questions. So more like explain, or go probe, go a little deeper. Like, did you also notice that you could solve it this way? Or expand, or make changes. So like, well, what would happen if I got this wire? I changed the circuit. Students are already familiar enough with the circuits so that they should be able to answer that. So the idea was, can we ask these kind of these probing questions? Can we ask why, when? That's a little bit of a different aspect than what we were testing with the written exams. So,
Can I have a question directly from the audience? The point of clarification, the students have already access to the problems beforehand?
So in this example, they did not have access to the questions that we were going to ask them, but they did have access to, so on the left, the problem was given so that at least they were familiar with this. So so we didn't explicitly ask hey, how did you solve this, or look at the solution for solving this. This was more of a making sure that students were already familiar with it. Because even if you were to ask me this question, if you were to give me this, right, and you're like, why is the current zero? I'll be like, okay, give me a second. I need to think about this first, right? And we wanted to kind of skip that step. So that was kind of the idea. But I will actually go, I'll have a little bit more about this as well, because everyone did it a little bit differently. Okay, so why were we interested in oral exams? We looked a little bit at the literature as well. And there's actually quite a bit of literature on this. So what are the benefits of these oral exams? Benefits that we also found is that you can assess conceptual understanding more so than on a written exam. So you can ask why are you doing it? Are you sure this is the only way? It also provided some diversity in assessment. So some students are kind of better at explaining it. You kind of look at a little bit of a different aspect that you're assessing. And it promotes academic integrity. Not just catching people who are cheating, but also a big factor in academic integrity is people tend to, or if people think that other people are cheating, they are more likely to cheat as well. Because they feel like to keep up with the class, if everyone's cheating, then I would be an idiot not to, right? So just the perception of the fact that other people are cheating or not is a big determining factor in academic integrity. And so this is just the result of a little survey. So people did feel that these oral assessments, oral exams did contribute to academic integrity. So basically, even if we weren't catching anybody, just the perception alone is kind of a positive. So what are other benefits? to oral exams. And this was the change in learning strategies, right? So students tend to match their learning approach to their goal, and typically their goal is get good grades. So if your exam is if they can do well by just memorizing, this is going to be memorizing stuff. And so we wanted to encourage acquisition of conceptual understanding. We wanted to basically get students to the point where they would match their learning strategies to kind of do the deeper learning. That was kind of the hope. So we wanted to have an impact on the learning. And again, so this is now average over all those courses that we did. So we asked the students, they do believe that the oral exams increase their understanding, but far fewer have changed their learning strategies. So the impact on learning was a little bit mixed from like what we found or what we did. And then another aspect was the effective impact. Basically, oral exams also have the opportunity to kind of get students to be in a position where they're talking one-on-one with an instructor. They may feel more comfortable with an instructor now. They may feel more encouraged to come to office hours to talk to you. And we did see that. So depending on how we structured the oral exam, we definitely had that kind of increased sense of, oh, I can now talk to the instructor. And students could also feel more self-confident after an oral exam if they did well, or basically they got like productive feedback. And so again, we did a survey and we found that students reported that it increased their motivation to learn, and that they felt more comfortable reaching out to the instructor for help. Yes.
I understand this more as safety than belonging. Well, this is just how I look at it.
Yeah.
But I was wondering if this would be related if there is any measure on exam anxiety, because we know for the written exam students are fearful. So if this pre-intervention would decrease or have any kind of, make students feel exactly as you say, more comfortable. So they're not so afraid anymore. They already know you.
Yes, and I have a little bit on anxiety on the next slide because it's a very good point. So one of the concerns is indeed anxiety, right? So there are a few concerns with oral exams. Anxiety is definitely one of them, student anxiety. And so the sources can be unfamiliarity with the exam structure. So that was definitely the case for us because all our exams before were all written. So students had never done this. They're just completely spooked. Just the fact that they have to talk to you, right? It's a more intimidating exam format. And some students had some anxiety over the language barrier. We have a lot of international students as well. So what did we do was to provide a lot of information, right? That we definitely need to do that. We couldn't just say there's an oral exam, good luck. We talked about it in lecture. Some of us did mock exams. So basically we demonstrated an exam between us and a TA in lecture. We shared the grading rubric, so they knew how they were going to be evaluated. We offered practice exams. Some of us offered practice exams so that they could kind of like see what it was like. And also examine their attitude. Like if you're very encouraging on the exam, it definitely puts the students at ease rather than like sitting there and like, okay, this is a very tough as nails interview. So all of these are things we did and they helped a lot. Now students were definitely more stressed before taking the oral exam, before they got the experience. But so after seeing these remediation strategies, doing the exam, they were actually less stressed for the oral exam, that's what they reported, than for the written exam. Now, why were they more stressed for the written exam? It wasn't that written exams are more stressful, it's more like a bigger portion of their grade was on the written exam than the oral exam. So yes, initially there's kind of this like there's anxiety factor, but once they're there, it seems like if you're careful about it, it isn't a big problem. And yeah, students are still anxious, but they're going to be anxious for exams. So that was kind of something that we noticed. Now, we did not, and I'll talk about that in a second. We did not have a large grade impact for our oral exams. Yes.
What about those 24% who are still stressed after the oral exams? I mean, could something have happened during their oral exams? Maybe it didn't go well, or their grades, or the interaction maybe was less positive than for the others.
Well, I would say.
But maybe you don't have this information.
Yeah, so I don't have it. We don't have that information. We did have some follow-ups with the students as well. We had some open-ended questions, and we had some other follow-ups or teaching and learning comments. There are definitely students who, no matter what, are always stressed for an exam. So it's the fact that there was an exam, people are like, yep, I was stressed. Right, so it wasn't due to the exam modality per se. It was more the fact that it was an exam that counted for something. So I would not expect that ever to be zero, where people are like, yep, so totally relaxed for an exam. Everyone is totally relaxed for an exam. I don't think that's going to happen.
I think with the kind of oral exam, you're like adding a factor that you don't have in the written exam, which is like a kind of a subjective factor, right, of personality. Depending on who you have in front of you, it's, I guess, hard to avoid to maybe reacting in slightly different ways according to the students that we have in front of us.
Exactly. That is one of the other concerns for exactly the validity, reliability, and fairness of these exams, right? Because indeed, you have potentially multiple examiners, right? And you have different students. You may have slightly different questions, right? It is not as uniform. The one-on-one, you have potential for biases, and those are definitely concerns for oral exams.
I was actually wondering because I did not do oral exams like this, but like for example, for job interviews nowadays, they have oral parts, but the interviewer is not there. You're just like interacting with an informatic system who asks you the questions. You have a certain amount of time. So something like this removes the examinator and also removes this time constraint of you have 3 hours. Yes. Everybody can do it at the same time.
Yes, and I think that's a good point. So one of my colleagues actually did something like that, which she kind of framed it as a video homework, but it was essentially the same thing. Solve a problem and explain it on video, and then send in the video. So it was a similar kind of concept. So we took a different approach to this issue. So we didn't want to make it so I don't know, robotic, because and I'll get to that. So I will get that. It's because we saw the other benefits to be very important. The benefits that come from the interaction, from the fact that you are actually sitting across from a human, the encouragement you can get. But so it's still like what you brought up. It's still a concern. And so the strategy that we did was we did examiner training, and I'll have more on the next slide. And basically, we tried to make unique questions. We made exams low stakes, and also we just asked the students, like, hey, do you feel this is a concern, right? We can think, did the students feel it was a concern? And most students did not feel it was a concern. Now, obviously, if there's one student who finds that it's problematic, you have to look into it. But there's also people who would answer the same thing for the written exam. Was the exam fair? Well, it asked in a way that I wasn't familiar with or whatever. So with these remediation strategies, this concern actually never came up from the students. The students never came to us like, I really don't like these oral exams because I feel they're unfair, they're subjective. That wasn't a concern of the students, which is not something we actually had expected.
Can you explain a little bit more about the validity? I see the reliability and the fairness issues,
Mhm.
but what do you mean? Why would an oral exam have specific validity issues?
This, again, this is not something that we saw, but it's kind of like, this is kind of an issue that's brought up kind of for oral exams in general, depending on the different fields. I don't think for engineering, the validity was necessarily an issue, because we do feel that people need to be able to talk about their reasoning
Right.
for solving problems.
Mhm.
So this is, so in our case, we did feel that the exams were okay, let's put it this way. Valid, or the validity was okay within the constraint that I mentioned earlier, is that we still have written exams to test the other aspects of problem solving, right? So basically that the procedural knowledge is tested somewhere else.
Right.
But so by themselves, they don't test the procedural knowledge. So by themselves, that may be an issue, but as a complement to these other exam strategies, we don't feel that
Okay.
that there's an actual issue.
And you didn't measure any reliability and any interrogator reliability?
We did kind of point checking,
Okay.
based on recordings and I haven't talked yet about like how we structured it, but basically we had an examiner team. And so we did spot checking between the examiners.
Okay.
Yes.
There's another question from the audience.
Yeah.
Do the students have time before the oral exam to prepare open book the answer? How about open book exams in general, also for written exams?
So that's a difficult question to answer. So for the oral exams, in a few slides, I will go a little bit more in detail of like what questions we shared. For open book exams in general, well, we didn't look at that. So the only thing I can offer is kind of my own kind of personal experiences and what I've seen. For my class, it's kind of semi-open book. It's really about the process of applying things. So and for a lot of our exams, it's kind of open book. But yeah, I don't know. I think I would go on a bit too much of a tangent to really answer that question in any detail. Unfortunately. So now this kind of brings us kind of the big elephant in the room, at least for us, was the scalability. How can we do this for the large classes, for our large intro classes? And this was also like in the title of our proposal. So how did we do scalability? So as I said, we had an assessment team. So we used the instructor and our TAs, our graduate and undergraduate TAs, to be examiners. So that's how we kind of dealt with scalability. Now, that gave a little bit of a challenge. So we did also create training. So for all examiners, for the instructors and for the undergraduate TAs. So we worked with our Teaching and Learning Commons, and they created videos on the different aspects. So equity mindset biases, reducing anxiety for both for the examiner and for the students, promoting growth mindset, and you see there what it did. So it was short videos, then reflection forms that they had to fill out, and there was an office hours by the Teaching and Learning Commons as follow-ups for the students that were the examiners. And then there was also the court instructor would then give technical training to those students. We would have mock oral exams. We engage the TAs in exam creation. They would shadow us, and we would watch videos of their examinations as well. So that was basically training that went into it. We also provided a rubric and a script, so that basically everyone was kind of on the same page. And so this was kind of to make sure that we were limiting that inter-examiner discrepancy as much as we could. But we were aware of biases of the subjective nature, but also to reduce the stress for the student assessors, right? Because they were now in a position where they were not put in before. Some of them, like in later quarters, had been students in the class, they were familiar from the student side. But so we wanted to make sure that they weren't stressed. It was also they could opt out, so we didn't force them to be assessors. So they was the ones who basically wanted to do this. And also by limiting the grade impact. And what I mean is, if the grade impact of the oral exam was high, so for example, if it potentially could, it was high enough that it potentially failed a student. There was actually a two-phase process where if they were examining a student, they would not actually fail the student. They would basically say, oh, it's not good enough yet. You have to do a second exam with the instructor. And so they could only pass the student by saying like, yeah, that's good enough. It was not good enough yet. And then they talked to the instructor. So the instructor was the only one who then in the end would actually then fail the students. So that was again to kind of make sure that the student assessors were okay with this. Yes.
How big was your team here and how many for would you say 250 students?
Yeah, so it kind of depends. We did this for several, like 40 plus classes, right? It kind of varied. So if it was like a 25-person class, it was no TA. For the 300-person class, I had like a team of 13 TAs, but there was only 7 of them who participated in the oral assessment. Most of us had 2 or 3. That would help, but most classes were than 300, were like 100 or so.
So how many students per assessor roughly, or it's an average?
It kind of varied, anywhere from 1 to 5 or 10 to like 1 to 40-ish, 1 to 50. But yeah, then it's a lot of work. But so most of it was like, so how many hours? So I think for most of us it was kind of like limited to like 8 hours of examination. So 3 students per hour, so about like 25-ish students.
But from an organizational standpoint, the problem still exists, right? Whether you have to do it all on your own or whether you spread it out, there is an amount of man-hour that you need to have.
Yes, there is. There's definitely a number of, yes, there definitely, you need the man hours. It just doesn't need to be just you. It can be your team.
Yeah.
There is actually, with one caveat, I did do something different, and hopefully I'll have time to kind of mention a little bit more about kind of an alternative approach to the scalability. So as I said, we created rubrics. They were kind of like at a high level, but for some of my colleagues, what they did, they based it on number of hints given. So the grading was basically done like, this is a question you ask them. If they get stuck, you can give them this hint. This is hint number 1. And then if they get it after hint number 1, great, you get so many points. If not, yeah, you give them hint number 2. And it was kind of this tree of hints that you could give people. So the recommendation was definitely to grade on the spot, to not basically rely on your, like, oh yeah, the student, like, just take the time, write some feedback, take notes, grade on the spot. Yeah.
So the follow-up questions here appear only for rubric 1 and not before. So if somebody, say, offers a solution with minor conceptual errors, but then answers excellently to all follow-up questions, how would that fall into this grading scale?
Oh, well.
Or would they never get to the follow-up questions?
They typically wouldn't get to the follow-up questions. This is also a little bit of a shortened version. It had more detail. It basically would explain what falls under each one of these categories, but I just couldn't put it on this slide. So it was a little bit more detailed than that. But yes, you're right. And there were situations where the assessor is like, not quite sure, this happened, what should I do? So in terms of the grade impact, I already mentioned that we basically mostly went with low stakes because we only had like a short exam. Also the student stress. So we initially started mostly with participation based because we didn't have everything in place yet. Then we kind of went to like extra credit and limited grade impact. Some of my colleagues went to medium grade impact, let's say 10% of the final grade. The observation, you definitely need to incentivize students. If you don't incentivize, if you don't give a grade impact, students are like, they're just going to show up like, yeah, I just thought I'd talk to you. And they're like, they didn't study for this, you didn't really get any of or most of the other benefits. So a limited grade impact or extra credit was that basically where kind of our sweet spot was. And then, yeah, I already talked about what the questions look like. So we gave them a question, and so it's just kind of to answer the earlier question as, oh yeah, yes.
Yeah, the time.
Oh.
But that's the secretary. The question from the audience is, what would be the usual fail rates for an exam like this?
Oh, that really depends. For some, it was typically a little lower than the written exams, but it really depends on like how strict you were. But so for some of my colleagues, what they did was they offered students a choice. They said you can have a written exam or an oral exam. And so then the failure rates were basically such that they were about the same. So they were kind of more equalized. But if it was kind of an extra credit, then you were kind of a little bit more generous. So it really varied. And yeah, I know we're kind of near the end. I'm sorry, we're kind of running out of time. So this actually turned out to be the effective component, turned actually out to be very important. So we found there was a lot of benefit to the students if you would basically just offer encouragement, have a conversation with them, provide feedback. Students wanted to have feedback. So we were sending follow-up afterwards, like this is how you did. Initially we didn't, and just got a grade, and that wasn't definitely not good enough. They wanted to see like, what did I do wrong? What are kind of the points that I can improve on? But then we're like, it was really valuable to give feedback on the spot and tell students like this is what maybe you're struggling with a bit, this is where you could improve, and encouraging follow-ups, telling students like, oh, you know, just stop by office hours or just see me later. We can talk more about this. We don't have enough time now, but we'll talk more. And this turned out to be really important. So, and I know I don't have time, but I kind of hinted at this. Another way of doing this scaling was, in the end, what I decided was that the oral exam, because it was so short, we had students who were doing really well on the written exam. We're like, you know what? We know they know this stuff. We've seen them in office hours. We know they can explain everything. We're like, yep, you did great, just like expected. But the students, there were students where there was a lot of benefit, where they're like, oh, I didn't realize, I didn't understand this. Or like, there was really a lot of value for them to learn how to explain and for them to think. And so this was the students who actually were kind of a little bit behind in the class. And so what I started doing was give the oral assessment as an early intervention strategy. So basically for the students who are falling behind, rather than send them off somewhere else and kind of get like remediation somewhere else, we basically use these oral exams as more of a touch point with students, have them in, talk about them, talk to them, talk about like where they were struggling so that they could better understand. And so that was another way of making it scalable. So now I only had to talk to 50 out of 300 students. And it was the students where I could make the most impact. And so we were really focusing on these other components, not really as assessment, but it was really giving people extra credit so they would come in, they feel encouraged to come in, there was an incentive, but basically telling them like how they could improve their learning and kind of walk through these problems together with them. So that's kind of where I went in the end. Now, one thing is, in the end, still, and I don't have time to go through all the people basically, this work, this when people felt like that they were doing well on all of these, the one thing that didn't really go so, or we didn't have as good of a result was people changing their study strategies, their approach to studying. They weren't really changing their study strategy to basically get conceptual knowledge. And this kind of was a trigger to the other project, which is basically, we're like, why aren't students doing this? It's because they don't know how to often. We're like, we assume that basically students can just figure out how to best study. And it's one of these competencies. And so that's why we are now looking at that as well. We're like, yes, this provides the incentive, but also students will need help getting there. So that's why we're now looking at that aspect. So yeah, I'm sorry I kind of went.
The fact that they didn't change was only measured by self
Yes.
assessment, right? So they could have changed, but not knowingly changed.
Yes, that is true. That is
Because
true.
if you prepare for something oral, then you might change the somehow you start to practice a few days before, but you don't really think that that is part of the learning process. You think that just reading the book is the learning. And then you say, no, I didn't change anything, but you did.
Well, so I did ask the students, like, what did you do?
Right, okay,
How did you prepare?
right.
And so some students, about a third, basically said things like, I did mock exams, I went and talked to people, I practiced explaining with my friends. And some basically said, I just rewatched the lecture videos. And so explicitly was like, I did the same as for written exams. So yes, it's and in our current project, we are explicitly asking, what study strategies are you using? How are you approaching this? Are you familiar with this? And then, or like explain, like another thing was just students may not even know what conceptual understanding means, like what it is they're actually aspiring to. There's a lot of things that I think we initially took for granted that students would know, and then they don't. But yeah, you're right. There is we mostly relied on kind of students' perceptions of themselves.
Right.
And they're not always accurate. Definitely. Yeah.
A question regarding something that you mentioned a few times, that's comparing what you're actually assessing in a written exam and an oral exam. This is in a context that we're discussing here, something for final exams. Would you say that there are ways to design written and or oral exams such that they in the end are comparable in what they assess and what they measure in students' capacities?
Oh, that's an excellent question. So I think, so the way the oral exams were in Belgium, I think they tested, in my opinion, they tested more than the written exams that we have in UC San Diego. So so the way they were in Belgium was students would get the written exam questions, just very similar to like the written exams we would give in San Diego. So they would get like 3 hours or so to solve these long questions. But then you had like a time that you had to go see the instructor, and they would grade the problem while you were sitting there. And so they would go over it and they're like, can you explain why you did this step? Right? And or like, are you sure this is correct? And so that you wouldn't be able to do in a just a pure written exam. So it was kind of these, or like, then you would ask, what if I were to change this a little bit? What would change? Right? So this contextual thing. And so I feel these exams were testing more than just what I can do on the written exams. And I tried to do this at UC San Diego, like try to design my written exams in a way. But I think just the fact you can kind of react to what people say, and they're like, and then they make it, are you sure? And they're like, do you mean this? Oh yeah, I mean this. And then they explain, okay, fine, okay, I understand now. You also give people a second chance, and you get, so I think you, with an oral exam, you can definitely test, if you do the full written plus oral follow-up, you can definitely test more than just pure written, at least in the context of kind of the classes that I'm teaching and I took.
Mhm.
So I think we were trying to kind of do that a little bit with our oral exams, right? That I don't think they're as in depth as like a full procedural question that then students have to defend. We had like more, we were necessarily restricted to shorter questions, so I don't think the oral exam that we have plus written exam is equivalent to the long oral with an long written with oral follow-up. But yeah, is it possible to design it such that it tests the same thing? You would have if you just want an oral exam, it's gonna be really long because that procedural knowledge that we do need to test, that would be very difficult to just do purely in an oral sense. But so I think the full written and then oral follow-up, that's that good. And we had that a little bit. So some of my colleagues did that for the midterms. The midterms weren't a 3-hour exam, were like an hour exam. And then the oral exam was a follow-up on that midterm, like, but it wasn't right after. So it was in Belgium, you didn't have a chance to then get your written exam graded, know what you did wrong, look again at the answers and basically prepare. This was more of a like, whatever you had written, can you explain? The way we necessarily had to do it was, you have a written exam, you get feedback, you get your grade on it, you can talk to other people, you can revise and review it, and then there's follow-up questions on it. So now, we kind of thought, and I would argue that, you know what, if students then, in the intervening time, right, they're like, oh, they get the feedback, and then they're like, okay, now they realize what they did wrong, and they studied some more, and that's exactly what we want. We want them to do the learning, that then when they explain it, they're like, yeah, you know what, this is totally wrong what I did. And this is what I should have done. I don't think that's bad per se. Now they know what they need to do. So I don't know. So did that answer your question?
Well, maybe yes. The context here is that what we're discussing at EPFL right now is how to handle cases when a student fails or cannot attend an exam for medical reasons, and if they should be offered another exam later, which potentially should be in a different format then because of time constraints from the teachers, which would mean that a written exam for the bulk of the students could be converted into an oral exam.
I see.
This is what we're discussing that, and one of the big questions, of course, with that potential change of format is, can we be fair if we do that?
Mm-hmm. Yes, and I think that is a very, so we haven't looked into that question specifically. I think I think it would definitely not be easier for the person who would have to take the exam, that missed the original exam, because I think
It would not be easier.
yeah. So I think for the written exam, my feeling is, I also looked a little bit at how to, well, it was another project I didn't talk about, it was a very short one, but we had a strike of our graders last year. And so we suddenly, like, some people, we were in kind of a pickle, and like, hey, what are we gonna do? And then, so my question was, for these procedural exams, can I kind of make the question shorter, that I can still test the procedural knowledge in shorter questions, and only grading the final answer. So can I kind of make questions that basically test some of that conceptual procedural knowledge? And I think it is possible, but then really looking in detail at like our grading, what I found was that there's definitely people who kind of miss partial credit, but there's also people, on the other hand, get credit where they don't deserve it, even when we grade it. So I think it's much less likely when you have an oral part that you're going to get credit where you don't deserve it. So I think it doesn't seem like it would be unfair, but I don't think the people who would have the oral exam would have an unfair advantage. I think it's just kind of the opposite. and it's not that they're at a disadvantage per se, but I think there's kind of a loophole that other people may have, like where the written exam may not actually be as good as we kind of assume, at least kind of like when I was looking at that. So
Thank you.
A final question from the audience, and then we will close the session because we are over time, but thank you for the shown interest. So the last question is, if the grading strategy that you used was given to minimize the impact of the oral exams, does it make sense that student strategies wouldn't change much? And wouldn't giving more weight to the oral exam also convey the message to students that conceptual understanding is at least as important as procedural knowledge?
okay, so we did emphasize the fact that I actually have a whole lecture on like the importance of conceptual understanding and how to do it, and still that's not enough. That's why we're kind of looking at like how can we teach them better. Students, now we did, a colleague did experiment with making it more, have a bigger grade impact. And it didn't really make much of a difference. There is it's kind of remarkable, like, at least in the US, I don't know how it is here, but people really kind of like, they're really focused on their GPA. And so it is 3%, change it from a B to a B plus or a B minus. So that 3% is kind of seems like to be that cutoff where people are like, this is important. And like, if you make it have very, even sometimes like 1%, I would be surprised how people would kind of go out of their way for 1%. So you don't actually need to incentivize it very much, at least for our students, to make them really kind of see that it's not like it's a throwaway, that they actually do focus on it. So we did play around with the different elements of like how much credit, and we didn't after a while we didn't really see any significant impact. So I think I'm not sure if making the oral assessment a lot heavier in terms of impact would really have changed this a lot, and just a perception of that it's important. I don't see the written exam as not testing conceptual knowledge. I really feel like you're not going to get by with just memorizing things. You do need to understand what's going on, but I'm not sure if it tests as deeply the procedural or the conceptual knowledge. I do tell students, like, if you want to succeed, you need conceptual knowledge, and this is also like, it's going to make your studying a lot more efficient. If you understand what's going on, it's going to, after a while, otherwise everything is going to be like black magic, and you just have to memorize everything. But yeah, I do feel like we do emphasize it. So I'm not sure if people then would feel like, oh, it's only worth so much if you're testing this one thing. So yeah, we didn't look at like making it 100%, for sure. So I'm just kind of extrapolating, and maybe I shouldn't, but at least we weren't seeing a trend where we're like, oh, we should keep on ramping it up because it's going to make a difference. That's not what we were seeing. But yeah, thank you all so much for the great questions.